Hi everyone, Paul here from FamilyWheels.ca with another car review for your growing family. And let me get this straight here. You want the functionality of an SUV, the luxury of a BMW, yet you want to appease your green sensibilities. Well, this week we could have just the ticket for you. Since 2016, BMW has had what is one of the longest vehicle names in their lineup, the BMW X5 xDrive 40e. It's a plug-in hybrid SUV that gives you a modest amount of strictly electric vehicle range and then backs that up with a standard combustion engine as well. It's meant to go toe-to-toe with the Volvo XC90 T8 and a little less so against the strictly electric Tesla Model X. BMW really does see this as the future. Only 2.5% of all of their vehicles sold in Canada this past year were plug-in hybrids, despite the fact that they're offering a number of vehicles with this kind of power plant these days. But they think that by the time 2025 rolls around, they could have 6 to 10 times as many hybrid vehicles sold within their lineup here in Canada. My big question is, what are you giving up, if anything, when you compare this to its gasoline or diesel equivalents? So let's look at the numbers, let's go for a rip in this thing, and see how the 40e stacks up this week here on Family Wheels. Well, we're going to be focusing this week specifically on the 40e. So if you're looking for a review of the more conventional gasoline or diesel versions of the X5, you're not going to find it here this week. But that said, dimensions-wise, you've got a very similar vehicle. If we look at the trunk capacity on this car, it's actually a little bit smaller than the regular X5, and you can't get a third row of seating, which is an option on the gasoline or diesel versions of this car. And that's because we've got a big battery pack sitting there under that trunk area. But once you jump into the second row, you're gonna find exactly the same size and dimensions as you would in a more typical sibling from the X5 family. And that means if you've got older kids, kids in front-facing car seats, even adults sitting back there, it's pretty darn spacious, unless you've got really tall drivers or front passengers in this thing regularly. You're gonna have plenty of space in the second row. What that doesn't translate to, and this was a surprise to me, is a rear-facing car seat. We flipped our car seat around into rear-facing mode. It's kind of an average size car seat, and we're measuring 29 inches from the back of the front seat cushion up to the glove box. And that number doesn't really tell the whole story here, because there's a big sort of bump at the top of the glove box, which my knees are bumping into when I've got that rear-facing car seat in place, and I've rolled that front passenger seat up as far forward as it have to be in order for that car seat to be in there safely. That really was a surprise to me, given that the X5 is the largest SUV in the BMW lineup, as of right now anyway. Now, if you do want to jump into the 40e, it's about $5,500 more than the base price of a more traditional gasoline X5. Here in Canada, the 40e comes in at just shy of $75,000. Now, on top of that, here in our tester this week, we also have the $4,000 M Sportline package on board, which is giving you things like these badass looking 20-inch blacked out wheels, a sportier transmission with paddle shifters, comfort seats, and M badging all around. Then there's the $6,300 premium package also on board here, with everything from soft closed doors to heated rear seats to a 360-degree parking camera to a heads-up display. We also have the $750 smartphone connectivity package on board. That's giving you Apple CarPlay, but no Android Auto. BMW says that they just can't figure out how to make Androids work with their infotainment system as well as they'd like, so you can get Apple CarPlay at a price, but it's not going to work with your Android. We also have the $2,500 LED lighting package on board, and all of that equipment rounds out the price of our test vehicle here to $88,500 Canadian. And as I've mentioned before with other BMWs that I've reviewed, I just feel like there are certain things that BMW should be offering as standard in their vehicles that you have to pay extra in those packages to get. I mean, this is a $75,000 vehicle at its base price with this hybrid system on board. Yet, we don't have Apple CarPlay as standard. We don't have 4-zone climate control standard. Blind spot monitoring doesn't come standard. Even lumbar support in the front passenger seats, not standard in a vehicle which costs 75 grand. And it just seems a little chintzy to me when you compare it to some of the other vehicles and the offerings that you see in terms of standard equipment from them. But it is a really, really nice place to be. From the seats, to the switchwear, to this perfect balance between beautifully stitched leather, wood, and high-grade plastics. There's not a single surface or switch here in the X5 that feels like a corner's been cut. It all feels high-end, and it makes for a really beautiful driving experience. Now, I know what you might be thinking here. You're saying, yeah, Paul, come on, it's a $90,000 car. Of course it's gonna feel high-end. But I've driven $90,000 cars, particularly domestics like Cadillacs and Lincolns, that don't feel as high-end as they really should. That's just not a problem here in this X5 at all. And then once you actually start driving this thing, it's also really excellent. BMW's tuned the suspension and the steering feel to give you this really silky ride experience. It's also really quiet, and I mean like eerily quiet at times when you're driving exclusively under electric power. But even when you dip into that 2-liter, 4-cylinder, turbocharged gasoline engine that we have on board for passing somebody, or for spirited driving, or for driving at higher speeds on the highway, or even when you just run out of all that electric power that you've charged into this vehicle, it's still really quiet. We've averaged this week at 100 kilometers an hour, about 61 decibels with our decibel reader test, and even in luxury SUV territory, that's totally respectable. The other thing that I appreciate about the marriage between this electric motor and the gasoline engine in the 40e is just how seamlessly it transitions between the two. There have been times this week where I've been driving along and I haven't even realized that I've run out of electricity and I'm now running on the gasoline engine. It's just that seamless. And it's a good thing because this is a big vehicle. It's heavy. It means that if you do really pin it off the line, or if you go to pass somebody, chances are that gasoline engine's going to kick in. Also, your range in this thing, not particularly good strictly on electric power. Of course, it's going to depend on how you drive, where you're driving, the kind of weather you're experiencing at the time, and the kind of load that you have on board as well, the number of people who are in the back seat of this thing. But BMW figures that you should see between 19 and 25 kilometers as your strictly electric range. Which, let's be honest here, is pretty minuscule. I mean, that's a tripping back to the grocery store or a modest commute to the office, but I sure would like to see a bit more range out of the 40e strictly under electric power. One thing I do like about this vehicle, though, with its electric mode, is that unlike a lot of other electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles that I've tested, you can get it up to pretty high speeds before that combustion engine kicks in. I could get this right up to about 90-95 kilometers an hour before the gasoline engine had to kick in to really help it out. Another thing that's pretty cool about the 40e is that its towing capacity is exactly the same as the more conventional X5s, just under 6,000 pounds. So if you do want to use this for electric commuting in the city, but then jump into it on the weekend and tow what is a pretty decently sized trailer or boat behind you, you can still do it with this power plant on board. But I kind of shudder to think what your fuel economy would be like if you were trying to haul something behind you here in the 40e, because we've kind of had a split screen of fuel economy numbers in this car this week. In the city, it's been very impressive. Real world driving, where we've driven along beyond that 25 kilometer range and dipped into the gasoline engine, we've still averaged 7.9 liters per 100 kilometers, which is astoundingly good for an SUV of this size. But once you get it into the highway environment, all of a sudden that little 4-cylinder turbo is having to work really hard. It still feels very eager. You don't feel like you're lacking power, but that turbo's spooling up a lot, and the result is an average on the highway this week of about 11.5 liters per 100 kilometers. So you can see what I'm talking about here, that this car is certainly far better suited to the urban environment than it is highway cruising. You're going to see better fuel economy, in fact, from from the diesel X5 on the highway, and at times even in the city, than you do in this car. So you have to weigh that out in your mind. Well, when it comes time to plug the 40E in and get back into the grid to charge it back up, you open this little door right here in front of the driver's door and you have this plug-in point. Now, you've got a few options for charging this thing. The first up is this level 1 charging station, which comes with the vehicle. It uses a regular household style plug just like that, and you plug it into the vehicle like so. Now, it takes a little while for this to charge up with this station because you're using that standard household style plug. Just under 8 hours. That means that if you're going to try and use this throughout the day, multiple times a day to get the juice back up in this thing, it's not really an option. That's where the level 2 charging station comes in. That costs about $1,100 from BMW. You have to have a professional electrician install it for you because it does require 220 volt power, but that brings your charging time down significantly to just under 3 hours. Far more realistic for multiple charges in a day. Now, when we talk about getting around town, bunch of options there because there are now over 6,000 charging stations in Canada, and that's growing fast as well. BMW is really on the forefront trying to get more charging stations out there. Not all of them are going to work with this vehicle. For instance, Tesla has their own proprietary system. So if you go to drive up to a Tesla charging station, it's just not going to work for you here with the 40E. But you could theoretically stop off at the grocery store, charge up for a bit, head down the road, find another charging station and do it all over again. And BMW has rather cleverly put all of those charging stations across the country into the navigation software here on the infotainment system screen. Now, when I talked already about the trunk capacity in this vehicle, it's not quite as good as you see in the regular X5. That has a 650 liter capacity. This has a 500 liter capacity because we've got a bunch of batteries buried underneath the trunk of this thing. But I'm not entirely sure how BMW measures out that number because this actually seems like a much larger trunk than 500 liters would suggest compared to other vehicles that I've been testing lately. No problem here with our standardized trunk test in terms of fitting it all into this thing. Now, a few other little things to mention about the trunk here in the 40E. First up, this doesn't have a spare tire back here. Like so many other BMW vehicles, it uses run-flat tires. And those typically make the ride a little bit noisier, but I actually don't find that to be a problem here in this car because it's such a quiet ride to begin with, as I've already mentioned. The seats do fold down, the second row seats, and you've got a 40-20-40 split, so you can throw skis down the middle, which is great news. However, it's not a completely flat load floor once you put those seats down, and that's a bit of a pain for hauling around longer items. Big items do fit in here really well though, by the way. We had a bookcase in here earlier this week, no problem at all. Now here's something that you're either going to really like or really not like, and that's that there's a 2-stage trunk on this car. And that means that you've got to first lift up the trunk hatch itself, and then you've got to pull this thing down right here. That's great if you've got, say, groceries and you're loading them up and you don't want them spilling out onto the road. But it's not so great if you've got a family dog, and every time you go to get the dog jumping into the back of this thing, you've got this 2-stage process in order for them to do so. Either you're going to like it or you're not. The trunk here on the X5 though, even with those extra batteries, still totally usable, still a great size, but again, you're not going to be able to get that third row like we see in the diesel and gasoline versions of this car. Well, if you lead a strictly urban lifestyle that doesn't require you to drive long distances to go to work or go get groceries or go play, then the BMW X5 xDrive 40E could be a great option for you because you could theoretically be driving this vehicle under strictly electric power. But there are a few key things to keep in mind with this car if you're buying it for altruistic green purposes. First up, this vehicle has an average, as I've said this week, in the city of about 7.9 liters per 100 kilometers. And that's great for an SUV of this size. But if we compare this to a subcompact crossover, you're actually going to see those same kind of numbers in a conventional gasoline vehicle that doesn't have a hybrid system on board. You're going to be plugging this thing in overnight while you sleep. So unlike a regular SUV, which once you park it is no longer burning resources, this thing will continue to glug back all of those resources to charge those batteries back up again. That brings me to the third point, and that is that not all energy is created equal. Here in Alberta, for example, to this day, we still largely burn dirty old coal for our power resources. So it means that you're plugging this thing in, sure, but ultimately it's not going to be that much greener than burning good old-fashioned fossil fuels. If it were me, knowing my family and the fact that we do drive out into the mountains pretty much every weekend, it's just not a car that would make sense for the kind of driving that we do. Once you get this out onto the highway, you're going to find far better fuel economy numbers out of the diesel Q5 than you are this. Ultimately, Canadians drive long distances. It's a big country, and I think that if BMW does want to see more of their plug-in hybrid vehicles sold, we need to see a bigger electric range out of cars like the 40e. It's just too limiting. But it's your turn to chime in here. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on this car, which way you'd go in terms of an X5 power plant. Maybe this is one that you've already bought. Tell us what you think of it. Leave a comment below, subscribe while you're at it, and then the next time I see you, we're in a car that I am really excited about, not at all family friendly, but I got the invite from Glenmore Audi to take the new R8 for a test drive. We're going to take 600 horsepower of supercar out onto the highway and see how it performs. You can see that in just a few days from now, so make sure to check back in, and until then, have a great week.